Well, it's been a busy day, but we've got something for you. I hope it'll all make sense as we go through it. We're going to be looking this evening at the spirituality of media. And I think, our first instinct when we read this is to think of the blasted internet. Or all of what we're obliged to go through right now. When anybody says media, I'm always thinking of the awful news. I'm thinking of, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and God knows what other thing that they've just invented to make me feel old and out of touch. But that's not what we're going to be talking about. We are going to be talking about that towards the end, but I think what we've tried to do is put it into a rather larger and more spiritual context, so we can come at it from a variety of different angles. Who would like to start? Did you want to start?
I can yeah.
Yeah. Let's swap over. So you can come over here, and I'll come over here. Great. All right. Good.
So, that's our first slide. Here we are. With this very flashy colors that's really trying to catch your eye. So as Nigel said, we hear a lot about media of all sorts. We use and talk about social media. We watch different medias too. News outlets, etc. And media refers also for us to the technical tools we use to communicate, to store or deliver information, to store or deliver experiences, feelings with each other. So it's a very important part of our life has always been, and we'll see throughout history also how has been a spiritual tool. So it's artifacts, it's carvings, it's statues, it's paintings, it's icons, it's photos, it's movies, it's a lot of things. And also writings, it's hieroglyphs. Nigel is going to tell us a little bit about hieroglyphs as medias, alphabet, texts written or memorized, and it's also interpersonal functions. So the mediator is also being a media to a certain situation, intercessor, the internet, and social medias, as we just mentioned. So it seems to be, from this perspective, it seems to be a very broad term. It seems to be a quite recent and new concept and category, but it is actually ingrained in ages-old experience, reflections, meditations, about the ways in which reality is revealed to us. And media is all about revelation, about getting to know something, about truth in the end. And we're going to address this now through different slides and different. Okay, I cannot mute him. Anyway, yes. So it's all about the way in which a reality is being revealed to us, be it a news, someone's thoughts, or God's will. The earliest spiritual media, as Nigel is going to tell us a little bit about the very beginning of human creation and artifacts.
The instinct to create what we call media is really an innate human instinct. People have always done it from the dawn of time. This is the Venus of Willendorf. You can see it's already quite an advanced piece of sculpture. It dates from 24,000 BC. This is over 20,000 years before the construction of the pyramids. We can only guess in some ways what this image is about. You can sort of guess what it might be about, or what it might have been about. But this instinct to create is fundamental. It's an innate human instinct. People want to create in order to express themselves or to communicate with other people. You see, animals do this too. It's not just a human instinct. It seems to be an instinct of all created things. You can say that the whale's song is a form of medium. It's a way of communication, a way of expressing something over a very long distance. We might think of it as ephemeral, but then many of our songs as media are ephemeral too. They're vehicles of communication that we all use in one way or another, and they can be used in spiritual fashions or non-spiritual fashions. Where are we? Sorry. So the temptation comes when we confuse the media with the mystery. So what we end up doing is making an idol of the thing that we've created, instead of setting the thing that we've created free. If you look up idol or idol on the internet, you're probably more likely to get this perfume than you are to get a picture of what we would traditionally have in mind as an idol. But the perfume itself tells you everything that you need to know here, that the person who is wearing it is hoping perhaps they will become an idol in the eyes of the person whom they are trying to attract by using this perfume as a medium. So perhaps that's one of the most perilous aspects, I think, of contemporary media that's expressed through the internet. It seems to be very easy for us to mistake the image for the reality when it comes to the internet and reduce it to an idol. Very often people's online presence is extremely different from how they are in reality. It's a medium becomes a way to lie and to control. It becomes an idol. And perhaps the freshness or newness of the internet as a medium has led to this rapid idolization of that medium before we've really used it or learned how to use it. It's not the first time that people have mistaken a medium for the thing itself. It's been done for years. Here's an idolization of media. Here you can see share, internet, information, community, content, money, network, news. All of these things that drive people to this sort of addiction to the medium instead of an addiction, well, not an addiction, but an openness to what the medium is actually attempting to communicate and share, what the medium is actually for. This is the idolatry. And this is one of the reasons that spirituality has a conflictual relationship with what we call media. This little slide here is to illustrate the difference between the vehicle and what the vehicle is trying to express. On the left, you've got a little box brownie, which is a bald understanding of a medium. It's the way people used to take photographs. I think if you showed that to a young person today, they'd have a little bit of a trouble figuring out what it was actually for and why you might carry it around, let alone how to use the thing. But on the right, you can see what the medium was trying to bring into existence. It's a memory. It's a photograph taken through equipment like this. And when you look at the picture that it's created, the communication that this medium has produced, you can all of a sudden see that the physical object here, the object camera, is a purely physical object. But the picture itself, even though it's a physical object, communicates to us the memory, the story, what this medium is intended to evoke. I think you take over at this point. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
So as Nigel said, like there is kind of a difference between the medium and the media, if you want. It's quite of an artificial distinction, because as we will see, you have to understand this reality as in a way more fluid way. and a spiritual way rather than just setting stuff into categories, you see. So the word media itself is the plural of the Latin word medium, which means middle. So it's all about something staying in the middle, and communication is understood these ways. For communication theory, the media are standing in between the observer and the receptor, or the sender and the performer. It is thus, in sense of an ambiguous situation. It is between the object and the subject. It is not really either, but it can be used and manipulated, as Nigel has just shown us, by both points of views. So it can be objectified, it can become a tool to express your subjectivity too. So it's really ambiguous itself. The idea of media does not necessarily involve transcendence. And actually the term media has appeared in a very secular context. But it does not exclude it either. And you can look at past objects like icons, we will do that, as mediums and media. A text is a medium. Reading a text is engaging in a mediatic experience. It's the same with a movie. So one of the questions we can ask, and the first attitude we would have usually with anything, like any type of media, I would say, like if you compare television, for instance, and the internet, you would say, well, there are some medias that are active or seem to be active, and some where you seem just to be passive. You know, like when you're watching TV, you're not as active as when you are sharing something on the internet or on social medias, you see. So whenever you're watching the service, you're not in an active discussion as you could be in other forms of settings online, for instance. So we have the impression that there are some medias that are passive, whereas others are active. But that is, some would help us to communicate, to express something about ourselves, and would be social, whereas some wouldn't, like TV. For instance, people like put reading and social medias in contrast to each other. That's something you really see, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of young people also don't like reading, because they have usually this understanding of reading. But both are actually social mediations. If reading and TV and videos of all sorts, because when you read, for instance, it seems quite passive, but it triggers thoughts, it triggers feelings, it triggers memories, and you are invited to revisit your own life, your own memory. When I'm reading, I am really engaged in a social relation with the author, with the narrator, with the different characters you encounter in a novel, for instance. When I read, just like when I'm engaging on social medias, I have to position myself vis-a-vis the author. You know, whenever you're on Instagram, you think, oh, they have better, I don't know, I would say but like they're better looking at me. Then you position yourself towards this person. So you're engaged in a social and spiritual relation. And you do that also in reading, but it may seem less obvious. Many spiritual traditions would say that the most expressive, you have to find this. Many spiritual traditions would say that the most expressive a medium or media are, the less they're actually helping you to experience something spiritual. That is to say, these expressive medias are not the ones through which you are actually experiencing the most growth, because you are reacting, you know, instead of acting, of letting things, of being in a contemplative situation like you are when you're reading a novel, for instance, because you have some form of distance to actually what is happening. When I am on social media, it's quite different than from when I'm reading. In a sense, you're cultivating a form of attention that you, in this more passive, or like these medias which are actually creating this form of delaying. You're in a form of more. You're invited to cultivate your attention more than when you're on some medias that are actually directly giving you what you want. So the question now is, how do media teach us to position ourselves towards our deepest desires, towards the others, towards the questions we have, towards our neighbors, and towards God? Because medias are always in between, as we saw, they're the middle. And so we always have to position ourselves, and they're also creating these discussions we are engaging with others. So how can they become hindrances to this exploration, or on the contrary, pathways to this spiritual deepening? And that's what we're going to try to see. And we first want to challenge. So that was for the reading. You see like the big difference. I mean, that's also a very interesting picture, because you see on one you have like the devotional reading, but it also means like a form of setting, you know. And on the other hand, you have the social media where people are like their body position doesn't matter anymore. You see.
I think you made a really good point there, Joris, about the difference between interactive media. That the more interactive a medium is, like on the right-hand side, that's not necessarily a good thing in terms of contemplation and interiority and really engaging with things. You would say, who's engaged with the outside world more in this picture? And your instinct would be to say, oh, well, the people who are interacting with their friends on the phone there. But there are the friends, they're in two completely separate, invented little worlds, lounging around on a sofa, not really engaged in anything very much. I would say that the more focused attention, the more engagement is the picture on the left with Mary the Virgin immersed totally in the text, corresponding with it, immersing herself into it with such intentionality and lack of distraction. And on the right-hand side, you see a picture of distraction and rapidity and superficiality. Sorry to be nasty about it, but I think the point was, when you're talking about spiritual engagement or using a medium as a spiritual vehicle, this deliberate engagement and immersion is crucial to develop a relationship with the medium that you choose, whether that's a statue or a book or anything else we're going to mention. Or
even the social media.
Or even social media.
Yeah. Any type of media. Like it's not as such that it is really triggering the disintention. So now we also have to realize that a lot of our understanding in relationship to media and to reading, for instance, or like this on these two pictures, you can see it, is shaped and has been shaped by modern ideas about communication. Because we think in terms of going directly from person A to person B, and the message is the stuff that's in between. That's the information, the piece of information, you see, which is kind of a stuff that you transfer to someone else. That's a modern understanding of media and the modern understanding of communication. It assumes that the message is not alive, indeed. You know, it's a bit like this cargo you can see on the image. It's freight. It's not... it's freight, you see? It's something you transport from one place to another and that you transport to someone else. So there's this idea of it's totally devoid of any sense of context. It's as if the message is hovering above everything. It's totally disincarnate. It supposes there's this modern conception of humanhood, of communication, as something rationalistic, something objective, almost happening in a void, detached from any grounding. So it's quite of a clinical understanding of media that permeates so many aspects of our life and our sense of communication, because it's a very theoretic, intellectual one. And it's pervading everything, like the dating apps, which are ruled by algorithms, social medias, advertising, a lot of advertising has to do and has used these theories to actually convey you something. They're all always thinking about conveying something they want, and they're actually looking at the ways they're going to get you to where they want, not of thinking how you're going to interpret it for your own sake. So the medium is nothing really in this view, except a tool for an end. Besides that, it has no existence, you know? And that's what is interesting also. I mean, you realize that it's also related to question of ecology. When you look at this cargo, they're transmitting stuff created at the other end of the world to another place with a lot of pollution, because you're transporting the thing without actually thinking about what this mediation means. And this happens at all levels. That's a real spiritual evil and sin that happens at all levels of our existence today. So if you start to become conscious of the medium in this context, it's kind of threatens to destroy the ability to use it for its own sake, you know? Like whenever you start to realize that the boat is polluting, then there's a problem about this medium, you see? And it's exactly the same that's happening with your social medias or any form of media. And this idea of message and communication being freight and being a transmission of something that doesn't change is a gross mystification, because most of our reality is one of biases. Like 99% of our reality is one of biases, of misunderstandings, of failings to hear, to be heard, of translations, of intimacy, of places where you don't share, of healthy boundaries. So this idea of communication as being a transmission of something that doesn't change is a fallacy. Except for very technical stuff, we would say the glass is on the table. But even that, it's linked in a context. Which glass, you see? So whenever you're transmitting something, it's never freight, although we always think it's freight. Yes, so media per se are neither an obstacle or a gateway in themselves. It depends on our spiritual openness, of our hospitality and surrender. And one of the first story in the Bible is we're going to look at that a little bit later, but most spiritual tradition in the Bible is all about the problem and the questions about mediation. Mediation of reading, mediation of the book, mediation of how do we get to listening and to deeper listening. And this very first story, which is very famous, of Adam and Eve eating the fruit and everything, is quite interesting. That's a fresco by Michelangelo. And it's really interesting how you see the parallel between the snake and the angel, and the snake being the one, the bad mediation, because he is turning the people away from listening, whereas the other is the angel, so he's the one who is actually helping and giving the word of God to the people and to Adam and Eve in this situation. So whenever we try to do like Adam and Eve, to seize, to dominate the media, because that's what they want to do. They want to get the fruit, So we try to control what is being transmitted. We don't just live with it. It's a form of limitation of the meaning. We hear a lot about this, especially in new medias, maybe like news media. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all about controlling this message to get out ahead of anyone who might object. All forms of expression are also limitations, of course, like we saw. But some are more or less willing to give room for this otherness. And we will see that there has been, this understanding of media and communication as freight is a very linear one. So there are not many options. You go from point A, from person A to person B. But we will see that later, that how the media is actually thinking in terms of context, thinking in terms of interrelatedness, and that there's not one media. I think now it's your part.
Yes, yeah, I think so.
Yes.
Let's think for a minute in terms of the Christian tradition. Let's take, for example, the difference between an icon and an idol, because this really points up the use and abuse of media. In this case, pictures, paintings, if you like. In Christian traditions across the ages, people haven't always agreed on what is an icon and what is an idol. So here you can see on the left-hand side of your screen a picture of the iconoclasts of Byzantium, who were absolutely convinced that the production of idols was one of the reasons that had led to the fall of many parts of the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire to the Muslims. And they decided that this over-reverence of icons forbidden in the Old Testament as images had come down back on them to haunt them. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of a church in France, which was similarly subject to iconoclasts, perhaps even of the Huguenot variety. You can find many of them in England, where statues have been smashed up or beheaded, and statues taken out of churches and burned, and rood screens with their wonderful crucifixes being torn down and burned in the courtyard of the churches outside. So you can see that this tension between what people think of as icons and what people think of as idols has not always been so very easy to define, precisely because of what Joris was explaining. We're so quick to think that the things that we have created can neatly package a mystery. And so eventually we confuse the thing that we have created with the mystery itself, and we do a violence to it. So here's the difference, I think, between an idol and an icon. Here is what I might call for a second an idol. I've just used it as an example. An idol is a manufactured thing that you think possesses a power in and of itself. And you have an ability to channel that power, or you can control it by either appeasing the idol with offerings or threatening it with destruction. Here's the example. This is the god Sobek, venerated in southern Egypt. It's the crocodile god. And one of the things that happened in Sobek's big temple in Edfu was that people would make offerings to Sobek, saying, "Eat this instead of my brother Imhotep, who's out fishing today." Or, "If you eat him, I will smash you up into little pieces." Or, "If you don't behave, I will cease to worship you and bring you offerings." An idol is all about control. It's all about your ability to manipulate. It's a magical thing, a thing that you can manipulate to produce the desired effect, either on yourself, like a love potion or something, or on your friends, or on your enemies, like you would make a little wax doll or something and stick pins in it of somebody that you didn't like. This is an idol. It's a magical way of appropriating the mystery and trying to control it, to own it, to force it to do what you want it to do. An icon could not be more different. An icon, as a medium, is not controllable. It's going to invite you in on its own terms, not on your terms. Because an icon is also going to look out at you. It's going to invite you into a relationship with something that is much bigger than the medium. Through an icon's eyes, you feel the eyes of Christ looking back at you. And the conventions of iconography, as Nita has often explained to us, the small mouth drawing us towards this life of contemplation and silence, the large liquid eyes, sometimes even the bags under the eyes that are shown under the eyes of the Virgin Mary, even as a young woman, to foreshadow the suffering that she's going to experience. All of these conventions of iconography are going to be opening an understanding or an encounter with the divinized person that is present through that icon. You're not there to control that saint or that angel. You're there in a position of veneration, a position of openness to the mystery, not in a position of saying, how can I control this? What can I use it for? How can I appropriate it in order to be a tool to make the world how I wish to make it? So you can transfer this distinction, if you want, even to the medium of television or the internet. What are they trying to do to you? What are you making of them? Do you watch television in order to get from it what you want to shape your world? Or do you encounter the world of another and accept it as a mystery? What's the intention of Fox News or MSNBC? And how conscious are you of turning that into an idol to serve your own purposes and own understandings on the world? So you can see that this is a profoundly social question about media, as well as a deeply, deeply spiritual one. And it's a world in which our Christian ancestors have moved for thousands of years. They know the difference between these two things, and they know when an icon is tippling over into the land of the idol, when it becomes spiritually dead, because you've vacuumed its meaning and used it to serve your own purposes and stripped it violently of its mystery.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Nigel, what you're saying about idol, because I think usually what we come across also as form of idolatries today, and especially after the modern period we see here, and how is that ideas can become idols too. And especially today, like a lot of people, I feel, are clinging to ideas. Like in France, you can really see it. Some people use some like big idea, just like, I don't know, like freedom, or in the US, so too, freedom. But in France, it would be laïcité, like secularism, and people try to enforce an idea and worship this idea without actually doing it, like relating to it as in an iconic way, but is an idolatrous way. And then it can be creating a lot of domination and try to control other people on oneself, because it's also like a deep personal problem when you relate to your intelligence, to your reason in these ways. And that's what most of our society is about today with the ecocide. So yeah, that I think it's interesting to see that, Nigel. Thank you. Now, this question of idolatry and an icon is also deeply related to the way we read the Bible and to the way we are, like any form of religious activity can be idolatrous or iconic. And a lot of the ways the texts are written, the way the text is written in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament too, and how the two relate to each other, is deliberately organized and meant to discourage an idolatrous relation to the text. And that's what I'm going to show you quickly, that everything has to be mediated to be true to a certain extent. That everything has to be mediated, has to have a lot of relationship to try to convey a form of, not trying to convey a mystery, but letting the mystery dwell and letting the mystery come in. A good example of that is the tension between the modern and especially fundamentalist reading of the Bible, and the traditional ways. In some ways, the texts were actually written. In the modern fundamentalist readings of the Bible, there is this idea that everything is linear, that it's a historical, it's a linear depiction of past facts. For instance, that's where the creationist reading of the Bible comes from. Like the very beginning with Genesis, with the creation of the world and everything. People understand it in a very materialistic way. You see, they understand it as something historical, something linear. And that's not how the text is written if you actually read it. And everything in the Bible is about interconnectedness and relation. This is just an example of the very first chapter of the book of Genesis, where you see that it's not like going from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, but it's actually deeply related, because this part here, like the image or what is said in this part, has to be read with this one. And this one, this is the creation, so this is the days of creation. So day 1 relates to day 4, day 2 to day 5, day 3 to day 6. It's not only linear, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, until 7. It's also, if you read the text carefully, you'll see that there are these deep parallelisms that are inviting you to read not only linearly, but in a mirror. You're always doing a back and forth to come to the middle. You see, so it's a centering text. It's not a linear text. And you see that at other level of the Christian tradition and biblical tradition at large. I don't know to what extent it works in Islam too, but many traditional readings are engaged in this type of process. Here you see a stained glass that's doing that in image. So in the middle you have Christ, the resurrected Christ, you see? And around it you have different stories, which are stories from the Hebrew Bible. There's one that's probably from, we think, we're not sure about what it is, but it's probably from the Gospel too. This is Noah and the Ark. This is, I can't see really what it is.
That one there is Jonah and the whale. Can you see the little green fish?
The whale, here it is.
You can see the fish's eye and the little mouth spewing him up outside Nineveh.
Here. And here it's Rahab and the spies. So all the stories are stories about salvation. And in the middle you have the story of Christ, you see? And all the stories are to be read together. All these stories, Christ is kind of a lens through which you can understand the stories. But the interesting thing, and that's maybe also one of the problem of this type of reading of mediation, of mutual mediation, is that we're understanding as, like, we're reading Christ first and we're reading Christ in the other stories. But what he's actually doing, and what most of the text is actually inviting us to, is to read the story, for instance, of Noah and the Ark, and see how it triggered, how it revealed Christ, but not the other way around. So you can extend your experience of the revelation of Christ by reading text of the Hebrew Bible, for instance, which are typologically linked to the story of Christ's resurrection, like the Ark, the question of the baptism, or Jonah, getting out of the whale's belly. So all these images are deeply relating to each other, and this is creating a big network of parallels, of comparisons, that's inviting you to create, to compare moments, to compare characters, to compare situations. You have to rub them kind of against each other to have them start your own fire. Not to give you the fire. Like, the text is not giving you the fire. It's inviting you in the interstice of the different texts to hear the Spirit, because the Spirit is not the dead letter. It is the living Spirit, and it's going through all of these breaches between the stories, between the lines, you hear the story and the gospel, the living gospel, because it's resonating also to your own context. And that's how you move from the idolatric, modern, really developed in the modern period with fundamentalism, this type of reading of the Bible, to a iconic one, a one that's actually coming to you through this continual mediation of everything.
I think that's a really good point, Joyce. I think one of the things that you notice with our modern news cycle, for instance, is that one story very rarely relates to another one. Mm-hmm. The medium has become its own little shut-in world. So one minute we're worrying about one thing, another minute we're worrying about something else, and the stories are never put together. That we're mistaking the story for the bigger picture.
Sometimes there are some story, but which are actually mystification rather than mysteries, because they never give you their political line, for instance. And their political line is going to orientate. I remember looking at that, especially on the French news outlet, that there were different pieces of news, like, how do you call them, reportage. Mm-hmm. And the reportage, so you would have like some reportage about protests in Iran against for freedom, and on the other hand you would have another reportage about protests in the US, for instance, about Black Lives Matter. And on one side they would tell you a story about like sedition, like bad people or stuff, and on the other hand they would tell you another story about freedom. And then sometimes the way they put together the stories are actually leading you to some form of conclusion or giving you some form of subliminal reading that they're not going to tell you, but they're inviting you sometimes to make associations which are following their political views rather than actually giving you the fullness of the context, the fullness of the complexity of the situation. And so there are some ways of like suggesting associations that can be really misleading too. So it's not only disconnected. I mean, sometimes they suggest you associations.
Yes, subliminally somehow. They know what they're doing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. They've studied theology.
Mm-hmm. So this text, what I wanted to say about this interconnectedness of Christian stories, but all forms of story, because it's not only with the Bible itself, it's with your own life, your own experiences, you know. When we're grieving Marjorie tonight, when you as a Christian, you're always relating the question of someone's death to the death of Christ and his resurrection. So you're always putting yourself in these shoes. You're always relating, you're grounding it. And that's also relieving so much of the suffering. You realize that you're connected. You're connected to this through these stories. And these stories are also guiding you to the points of resolutions and to the hope, because you know other stories that are akin to that, and that leads to this hope. So these texts are training you. These stories are training you. They are not teaching you stuff, because when they give you stuff, like, it just flows away. You just replace the stuff and it's going to not help you anyway spiritually. But they're training you. So yes, there is a certain, for instance, in the Bible, a certain limit. Like it's limited number of texts in the Bible, but they are there to be continually related to you, to each other. So it's endless in a sense. You know, you have an infinite possible of relations, because you read them and you have to read them in your context. And so much of the modern move away from the Bible text have to do that they have also devoided the text of its contextuality. So if you understand the Bible as being a text about the past, who wants to read it? That's totally normal. You want to talk and create your own text, for instance. That's what the Book of Mormon is also about. You're creating a text because you're also trying to detaching the text from its contemporaneity. So these are deep questions about context, and some stuff we also talked a little bit about when we talked about Reformed spirituality, and how your reading is always a contextual one. So the limitation and the oppression are actually not the same. We usually associate limitation with oppression, but that's our liberal modern bias that thinks this way, and secular bias too. The texts are limited by the connections, but the connections are actually illimited. Now, Nigel, do you want to tell us about this image is perfect to talk about what I wanted to say. You know, there are very fun images that you can find in a lot of places and with a lot of different associations, you know, like also this creativity about associating things and expanding your experience of the same image, because the image on the right side here are usually the same, but on the other side you will have like different things. I don't know, like one cat, like one kitten, two kitten, three kitten, 10 kittens. Yes. So you can put anything. But what is interesting with this one is that it's talking about media. Here it's talking about screens, so it can be also a way of diverting yourself more and more. But the more you divert yourself, you divert yourself, maybe the more you're actually going to be grounded, you know, because you're spinning so much that you're coming to a certain space of stillness, just like the image of these little tricks, you know, when you turn the disc and you have the impression the bird is in the cage, or so.
It's funny, isn't it, how we think of the internet as a multitude of distractions and too much input and all of this. And yet we say, you know, the more Bible stories you know, the more you can input into the interpretation of the resurrection, because you've got a rich background of associations. We think that's a good thing, but we think it's a bad thing in the case of the internet because we call it overstimulus.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't call it overstimulus because we know a lot of Bible studies that sort of relate to each other. So I suppose the point is, too hasty a judgment of any medium is not a good idea. We have to give it an opportunity to show its true colors and shape it and try and use it for the highest spiritual purpose.
Yeah, I think the point is that the multiplication of media is not a problem per se. The problem is the multiplication of media when they are not related to each other. And this is what also, like, you can know a lot about the Bible and know a lot about the stories in the Bible, but if you don't relate them, that is totally pointless. Just like it's the case with the screens. You see, like, and actually at the moment we are using 2 screens, and Nigel, maybe
4, I think.
4 screens. Well, at least we have 2 screens who are connected, and that's actual improvement of our practice, and it's really helping us to do that. So it's not only something technical, but it's also a thing thinking in terms of relatedness. Like, multiplication of media is interesting when it's helping you to ground things. Now Nigel is going to tell us something about Egypt again.
Well,
Nigel.
These 2 pictures here show 2 different aspects of hieroglyphic. Writing was invented in Egypt probably at the same time as it was invented in China and in Mesopotamia. That is about 3000 BC, 3200 BC. It's very interesting the way how all of these things happen. If you have a little look here on the right-hand side, let's look at this image first. If you look at either side of Tutankhamun's head, this is who we've got, it's the back of his throne, you will see his name. See here, on the top you've got a bird with a little sun disk behind it, which says that he is the son of, and on the right-hand side, you've got a little bee and a little reed. This is saying that he is king of Upper and Lower Egypt. On the bottom of it, you can see the Ankh symbol here and a little loaf of bread, this pointy thing, which means that he's given life. Given life. These are other blessings on the left-hand side. But notice the way in which his name is written. Words, as Joris has said, are a medium. And here, back in ancient Egypt, we're looking at this picture and we can see that Tutankhamun's name has been written inside a knotted rope. Can you see this? Here's the knot at the bottom, and here is the rope that goes around it. It's a cartouche. On the right-hand side is his Egyptian pharaohs were named more than one thing. So here you've got Tutankhamun, the living form of the god Amun, and on the right you can see Men-Kheper-Re, the god Re has appeared. The interesting thing about this is that hieroglyphic is one of those alphabets that contains image as medium and letters as medium. So there's a magical connection between these two things. And you can see if you wrote the name of somebody and you were worried that that name was going to be abused or misused, turned into a place of power like an idol, you could protect it with by magically surrounding it with a cartouche, which makes a sort of wall around it, protecting the magic of the medium from abuse by people who would will ill. On the other hand, on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see a series of bound captives in bas-relief here. If you depicted your enemy in ancient Egypt, what you depicted became alive. This forcible connection between the medium of writing and the reality of the world in which we live. So if you depict an enemy, you'd better make sure that his hands are bound behind his back to stop this image from jumping out and doing you any damage. There's a real vivid connection here between what is depicted through the medium and what is real and what is concrete and what you have to protect yourself against. So anytime you write the name of Set, the god of chaos or confusion, depicted by a long-necked jackal, you must draw the hieroglyph of a knife stabbed into his back to avoid his jumping out and causing you any damage. Here you can see the enemies have their arms bound behind their back because of the power of the medium, of the picture, of the image, of the word, of the hieroglyph, and its potentiality to become real. A very, very forcible illustration of what we mean by media and the difference between an icon and an idol. Now you might think, well, this is all very fancy and ancient Egyptian and all to do with magical and pagan stuff, but let's open the Bible just for a minute, and what we're going to find is the same sort of idea occurs in the book of Numbers. The priest shall put these curses down in writing and rub it off into the water of bitterness. He is to make the woman drink the water of bitterness that induces the spell. So that, we'll find out what so what in a minute. This comes from the book of Numbers, chapter 5, verse 23. The idea behind it is that the medium of writing, the words themselves, have an impact, have a direct, immediate effect on the real world. Here's a man who suspects that his wife or his daughter has conceived a child by somebody who is not legitimately allowed to engender a child. So you're supposed to write these verses down onto a piece of slate. You then wash off the slate into water. You cause the woman to drink the water, and if she has a violent reaction to drinking the words, you know that the child that she is bearing is not your child. So we can see here that the medium becomes so much associated with lived life that the ancient world saw not very much of a distinction between the two. It's very modern to reduce the medium into a hermetically sealed, controllable, idolatrous little box. And we have done the same with the world in which we live. We have separated it out from our own reality, turned it into an artifact and exploited it. In the ancient world, that sort of move was not really as possible.
So you may think, well, okay, Nigel, thank you for this history of ancient Egypt, but we're no longer in this world. But as Nigel said, like, the modern times has really changed our relationship to medias, and they are also made accessible for a lot of us. The extreme majority of people in developed or Western countries, the ability to read. From a very young age, we read. We all consider reading, writing, and even deciphering some stuff as a fait accompli, as a done deal. You don't think about it. You don't see the letters anymore. You just see what they mean. We think of it as a tool for communication most of the time, not a media, not a way of controlling, not a mystery, not of anything like this. We don't realize that we're encountering something mysterious and secret, that there's something strange happening about it. Even outside of a religious context, even outside of when you're actually opening the Bible and reading and say, oh, I'm going to read something that's going to come to me, something, whenever you're reading, you don't realize that, but it's all the time something, it's not just something technical. However, reading itself is a very, very complex encounter with mystery. How come that these... Oops, I think we forgot a slide, but that's anyway. No. How come that certain... Here, like, just look at this. How come that these letters, here they're black, like black-shaped stuff, trigger vision, such as if I write here bitterness, you have an image of bitterness. If you see water, you kind of see a stream, or you see something, you see water. So how come that this, here it's on your screen, it's even pixels. How come that these pixels of a like green, brown, yellow pixels trigger the image of a cute little hedgehog? How come? How come that something like this happens? So medias have always been, like you're always relating to it in a, they always put yourself in this question of wondering if you take them seriously, if you don't assume what they are, if you don't assume what you want to get. This is a famous painting by Magritte, where it says, this is not a pipe, but it's actually depicting one, but at the same time it is true that it is not a pipe because it's just a depiction of it. You cannot smoke with it. I really like this quote. I find it's very thought-provoking. Reading is just staring at a piece of dead wood for hours and hallucinating, or staring at a screen for hours to little crystals and hallucinating. I find this quote particularly interesting if you think of the cross too, but we're not going to talk much about that. But it's really challenging when you think also at the contemplation of the cross and the reading of the Bible, and you try to relate them together when you think in these terms of the magics that's behind both of them, the spiritual experience. So when I read, medias are only alive because they trigger more or less controlled relations, as we said. The problem with some contemporary medias is not that they control meaning, because all media do, but they provide only a linear story. So when I read a book about a love story, I am not reading an epic, of course. But the problem is that a lot of these contemporary medias we're encountering and living with, they um, they don't invite to creating more connections. So it triggers linear, individualistic, monolithic, hegemonic, as Nigel showed, one referential relations, and it offers only limited way to relate them. So here is an interesting text. It's a text by Evagrius, who is one of the church fathers, and it also tells us about the deep spiritual relationship that we can have with media if we don't get engaged with them in this linear, dominative, hegemonic, monolithic way. But if we actually let them enter us, and if we let them as something, as a place of a flow. So here you see, it's in part of his letter to Melania, also called the Great Letter, and it's all about, he's talking about the power of writing, the power of letter as a spiritual exercise, as a spiritual media. And although far from one another, they are brought near through the letter. And from far away they see and are seen, remaining silent they speak and hear. And although perchance sleeping, they are awake, for their desires are in fact fulfilled. And although sick, they are healthy, sitting they walk. And I would go so far as to say that even though dead, they live. For written characters have the power to impart not only things present, but also things past and future. So whenever you're reading, for instance, the Bible or any other text, a story, but with the Bible I find it interesting that we usually think that we're reading the text and we're getting information, for instance, about the resurrection or about the past. But we never really think in terms of the text conveying us the presence of the resurrection, the presence of the past stories of God's revelation through history. We usually think in terms of message again, but not as a way of actually presentifying to us an actual physical doorway to this other reality, this spiritual reality. Do you want to add something, Nigel, on what I just said, or do you want to...
Sure. I like this quotation that Joyce found from Teilhard de Chardin, because this gets to the heart of the mystery of what media, what we're trying to say about media. Teilhard de Chardin said, "There's neither spirit nor matter in the world. The stuff of the universe is spirit matter." That what we do with whatever medium we're using, whether it be the internet or a statue or the written word or the Eucharist, as we'll see in a minute, we realize that we can't separate the world into this is matter and this is spirit. The whole point of our media creating nature is to blur the distinction between these two worlds that we've artificially created. We can't do that. It's not possible to do it because we ourselves are an almighty, holy, mysterious mixture that can't be divided or separated. We ourselves are media, media of God's love, media of God's creative spirit. How can we separate these things out? As soon as we separate them, as soon as we crystallize them into definitive forms, we open ourselves up to idolatry and abuse and exploitation, as we've discovered.
Yeah, I think what you're just saying, Nigel, is really, for me, it's really revealing the depth of the redemption in Christ as being a redemption through the media, and how when you're really engaging in this mediatic way, you're actually reaching and you're being reached by the spiritual reality rather than just relying on some form of message or information that could be understood as the law. Yeah. Yes. You want to go? So yeah, with this study about media, we also wanted to relate it to the other studies we have done, because we realized that in passing or interweaving with all the other studies we have done, the one about Celtic, about Marian spirituality, about Reformed spirituality, we all talked about different medias. We talked about revelation through creation and creation as a media with Reformed spirituality. We talked about the interweaving of different medias with Celtic spirituality. We talked of the mediation of womanhood, of in birthing, giving birth as a form of media to when we talked about Mary.
Mm-hmm.
What else have we talked? Icons. We've talked of the Orthodox. Nigel has talked about the Orthodox tradition. The Ignatian tradition also as a mediating your own spiritual life through stories of the Bible. Have we reviewed all the?
I think we have.
Yes.
Yes.
So there are many aspects of what we've done so far together has been looking at different medias and how looking at actually all these different media spiritualities, which are different medias to our own mysterious spiritual life, is really interesting to continue to do.
On this slide, I just wanted to talk briefly about how we wed ourselves to a particular sort of medium. And we think that's it. It's the holiest thing you could possibly get, and don't meddle with it. At the very beginning of Christian history, of course, the sacred scriptures were written on scrolls, and people probably thought, well, these scrolls as media, essentially they enable you to unroll and see how one text relates to another text, and as you try and find that passage of Isaiah that you're interested in reading, the act of rolling to that place gives you an opportunity to pray and think and imagine how all texts are rolled up into the one God. How dare you suggest that we cut it up into little bits and stick it together and bind it in a book? That is sacrilegious. That is certainly not what we want to do, because it's destroying our relationship to the Word, expressed as it is through the medium of a scroll. And then Christians said, no, wait a minute, if we cut it up into little bits like that, you're going to be able to find your passage a little bit quicker. And then suddenly we say, or used to say, we don't say it so much anymore, but when you were given a Bible at confirmation, or when you've had your own Bible for a long time, you think that this is the normal medium. I don't want to be using the Bible that's on a Kindle or something. This is sacrilege. I can't leaf through the pages. I can't feel it in my hands. I can't see the scribbles that I made in the margins, or the places that I coloured in when I was 16 years old, or the places I stuck a little bookmark because of a visit to a certain sort of place. So you can see our intimate relationship with the way in which even the biblical passages themselves have been collected together. Imagine what people thought after they said, here's a medieval Bible, produced prayerfully, letter by letter, colourful stroke by colourful stroke. And then along comes that heretic Gutenberg and invents the printing press where you can produce hundreds of these in a day. Doesn't this dissociate yourself from the text? Doesn't this invention of this new media, this new technology, rip away the sacred nature of the book that you're using for a relationship with God? And then now the printing press gives way to the internet. And we can hear people cry once again. This is stripping people's intimate relationship with the sacred word of God away. People should have physical Bibles and get used to leafing through them. How will they know where Jonah comes in relation to Habakkuk if they haven't got a physical Bible in their hands, or whatever fuss they might be making about that particular thing? The point I wanted to make really is that every generation, every spirituality has its own form of expression, and we get quite wedded to them. And there's nothing wrong with that, so long as we don't idolize them at the expense of somebody else's method. I'm not saying one is more perfect or less perfect than another. I hope that people will get more adept at using certain things like an electronic book. Though for myself, that day will never really come, especially when it comes to the Bible or the Book of Common Prayer, because I like a physical relationship with the thing that I'm reading. And I don't really want to be reading the sacred words of the Bible in the same mechanical way as I might pick up a blinking Agatha Christie novel and use the same sort of medium for both things. It's a personal preference, but there we go.
Maybe just to come back to this slide, because
they put an important slide on the right.
And I also find really interesting to see that the different material objects we're using to read the text, be it online, be it scrolls, or be it codexes, like books like this, has so much to do with the context in which you're reading it, you know? Like when you have a codex like this, you can have way many more books than with the rules, and you can travel with it. So it's also grounded in a form of context once again, and the relationship we have to media is always a contextual one. Just like today, you can also read on your tablet without light, and that's quite handy. But what I wanted to say quickly about this, that's a emblem. So in the 16th and 17th century, there were a lot of emblem books. So what is interesting about that is showing that medias relate to each other too. Just like you see the context in which you are is related to the book you're using, and trigger a special spiritual fruit for you if you're actually paying attention to these connections. And here you see there's in emblems there is usually sometimes there's a Latin quote also on the text, on the image. So you have a little image, and then you have two-parted little sonnet or something, which is relating the two. So it's also all about relation between these two. And it's inviting you to relate the image to the text. And it's just a good conclusion, I find. Here you have the same process. You know, you have surely the text of the Annunciation here, and you have the Annunciation here. So it's really helping you to break down the binary and the polarity that we usually have between images and texts, which has been really reinforced by modern fundamentalism, and it's has triggered the also poor relationship we have to the environment and all form of physical complex form of representation which are going beyond the letters.
Here's another medium, very briefly. It's a relic. And just to remind ourselves that different generations have found different ways of expressing their faith, and here through media of various different sorts. In the Middle Ages, relics were thought to possess a sort of spiritual power of themselves, and sometimes they might have been used as lucky charms and turned more into idols than icons. But here it's mediating a power that is inherent in the thing, perhaps, but it's not the thing itself. It's an access to the quality of this particular saint whose foot you're about to kiss. So it becomes a medium of something greater than what ostensibly it might look like on the surface of it. This little window is the kissable thing, presumably, where you can actually see the bone inside. I wanted to talk very quickly about the Eucharist. Is the Eucharist a medium, or is it a real presence? This is something that has exercised people for a very, very long time. And I would say that within the more rigorous Protestant denominations, the practice of venerating the host in a monstrance is considered idolatrous, because they believe that it's containing or controlling and using what cannot be contained, controlled, and then used. So this idea of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, it raises this very acute question about what media actually is. In this particular instance, you're looking at a monstrance. Normally it would have the wafer inside it that had been, or the host inside it, that had been pre-consecrated by the priest. And the light rays that you can see radiating out of the monstrance are a medium to show that Christ's blessing rays radiate out from this monstrance to those who are present. I'm haunted at the moment by the connection between this monstrance and the camera lens. Mm-hmm. It's round, it's glass. What are we seeing? What am I seeing through the lens? And what do you see the other side of it? What sort of presence are we conveying? And I know we can't take the physical Eucharist at a distance in this sort of way, but when I raise my hand in a priestly blessing, I have to believe that the same sort of thing is happening, that the light rays somehow are communicating themselves across to those who might be listening or watching. It's not just the content of my words reduced to that sort of raw, contentless, freight-like expression of meaning, but something that is more multidimensional than that, more of a real presence than just, this is what I want to say to you. I hope that through the medium of the internet that we've been reduced to using under these circumstances, that real connection, that real presence is felt. That I certainly feel it this side of the lens, of the camera. I feel the presence of the people who are there with us. And I hope and pray that can happen for those who watch and listen too. I hope that God is able to use this medium, as halting and as difficult and as complicated as it can sometimes be, as a way of blessing, as a way of intimacy, as a way of sharing a mystery together. Perhaps not the same as sharing that mystery when we're physically present to each other, but at least it's something. It's akin to a benediction as opposed to receiving the host on your tongue. That's as close as I can get to it just at the moment, and I know we're running out of time rather, but that's perhaps something that we could explore at a different moment. There's the elevated host in the priest's hands before it is put then afterwards in the monstrance and raised over the people in an act of blessing. I hope that makes sense. I think it's territory that we're all trying to explore with kindness and understanding and a deep sense of loss and frustration at the same time, just at the moment. Here's a picture of happier days. We were preparing the Koliva for All Saints last year. The cake is a medium, just like the Eucharist perhaps is too. And our stories that we tell around it, here we were preparing the Koliva for Ulage, Chantal's husband and Kiese's father. The stories that we told around the table as we mixed things together, Chantal told us the story of how they'd met. Isn't that right, Chantal? Remember? It was a happy moment. And the children perhaps were hearing that story for the first time, of the broken heel at the bus stop, of how you met the parents for the first time and what happened with that. The cake itself became a medium for us to share those memories, and then to share them on the Sunday too. That media can be very physical, they can be very, well, I think that I can't think of any medium that isn't necessarily. You have to have a screen to be able to watch it. We have to have equipment to be able to to connect with each other. Every medium involves.
Yeah, I think every
this.
medium involves that, but we usually think that they don't. Like when
Yes.
you read, for instance, you have this mystification that you think it's not a medium, but it is.
Yes, you forget the presence of the book in your
hand. You forget
hand.
the presence of the book, you forget the presence of the media.
And there we can see rather touchingly Marjorie in the foreground here. It was one of the last times that she was really well and with us, sharing that moment. And it's rather poignant thinking that this year, God willing, if we're able to be together, we'll be preparing one for her too.
Yeah.
And there we are, all in the garden, eating it all together in celebration. And celebrating the fact that that medium is entering into every single one of us in that certain way.
And in Christian community and any form of interrelations, we're being medium for each other too. Whenever we're sharing and opening up.
There we can see everybody, I think. And then there's Rush, look, we can see here in this particular picture. And Anne Cadore, right here in the picture. See? And here's Kiminu coming down the stairs with extra wine, probably. There's Jean-Paul down here, bottom right-hand side. And Ruth here, standing by the table. Perhaps we should have a slideshow one of these nights to remind us of what we're missing. We've got some wonderful pictures of lots of people. And I think it would be a nice way to share them one night. Perhaps we could do that as an end-of-term party for the last summer study that we're going to do. We could make ourselves a little drink or a little something to eat, and we'll have tons and tons of church pictures to show and happy memories to share. I think that will be rather nice.
Yes, that was a short conclusion in picture, on image, of how medias are actually always to be put in perspective and how we relate to them. And we are always invited to find the right distance to them, to actually being able to relate to them in a good way. Here you see this beautiful picture of two hands doing a little heart. But I try to find a picture of Christ, for instance, and with all the pixels being different pictures. So what you can see, like if you just look at this, the one on the left, you wonder, well, okay, these are different persons, but I cannot see the big picture. But when I have a look at that, I see the big picture, but I cannot see the detail. So the spiritual work we're all engaged in is this continual back and forth movement. Past, present, future, hopes, despair. And accepting that is a lot of the part of understanding the media, I find. And it's the way of encountering who is the ultimate media of our life, and how we can go deeper in our understanding of Christ, and how this is coming to Christ through this reflection of different medias, I find, is quite enriching and really helping us to understand what does the mediation mean in its complexity, its wealth, how it's being revealed through different ways, and even social media, as you can see. And this is a very interesting picture too, because it's saying and it's unsaying. It's not saying much about its assumptions too,
No,
like racial and a ton of biases. So it's an icon, it's an idol to a certain extent too, because it's also idolization of a certain vision of Christ, and it's also related because it's inviting you to like and share. So it's I think this image is quite embodying and encapsulating so much of our reflection about media. Because of its ambiguity and at the same time its hopeful connectedness, and how they also relate intimately to our experiences and to our experiences of Christ.
I thought of a few ideas for a spiritual exercise to finish our evening. Does the practice of creating a little corner in your own house where some of these media can be put as a place of prayer, and having a prayerful relationship with each one of those things. A candle itself is a medium, as we discovered tonight when we said Lucernaire instead of evening prayer, reminding ourselves of the light that can never be put out, the light of the resurrection, and praying for Marjorie in that connection and her family. A small icon, or the burning of incense, for instance, a medium that expresses our prayers rising to heaven. You might want a rosary in that corner, or a little physical object that you might handle as you pray or meditate or reflect on something. Those corners where you keep those media together can be quite beautiful things, and reflecting on some of the ways in which we've reflected tonight on media, knowing that they're not places of control or magic or force, but they're places of openness, places where you open yourself up to the deeper mystery of encounter, that our physicality, that the things that we use or interact with lead us to, as we discovered with the labyrinth, as we discovered with the rosary, and as we discovered with some other spiritual exercises like icons that we've looked at in the past. But here's a few questions to finish with. It's difficult not to be conscious of the fact that we're on camera, but I never lose sight of the fact that we're broadcasting. How about you, Joyce?
I never lose sight of that either. Yeah.
Mm.
But I although I have a different relationship to the broadcasting, because it's also recorded, and that also makes a different experience, I find. It feels that you're doing it on live, but you know it's going to stay. So you better be careful.
Yes, that's right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We haven't decided quite what we're doing next week, but I'm sure we'll come up with something.